Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to have a simple setup of PfSense Firewall. The scenario that we'll implement to try out PfSense and see how it works. It's going to be one client machine situated in a local network, and then we will have PfSense with two interfaces. One interface is facing the internet and another interface facing the internal network. So that's basically how the setup is going to be. So we'll start the whole thing by setting up the local network. I'm using virtual machine workstation here. You can do the same experiment on VirtualBox if you like. So I'll go to Edit and Virtual Network Editor. So on the Virtual Network Editor, I'm going to set up VMnet 11 as my local network that I will use for this setup. So what I will do is I am going to set up the network with these particular settings. First of all, I'm going to untick this box. I'm going to select host only, so that the local network is not connected to the internet, and I make sure that my local client that I will use here is not connected to the internet in any way. It's going to be connected to a closed local network inside the virtualized setup, and not connected to anything else other than the firewall as the default gateway. And because of that, I'm going to untick this box. Connect a host virtual adapter to this network. I'm going to untick this. I don't want my physical machine to have a virtual adapter inside this network. I want only the firewall and the client machine. And then use local DHCP. I'm going to untick this as well. I'm going to use the PfSense firewall. It has the ability to operate as a DHCP server, so I'm going to use that as well. And that's why you see, and the IP addresses here do not matter because we're not going to use them anyway. So host only, untick these two boxes. Of course, you'll need administrator privileges to be able to do this. And you can pick any number. I'm just picking VMnet 11. And I'll click OK. Now I will start the setup by creating a new virtual machine. I'll go with custom this time. Depending on the version that you're using, I have my preference is 16.x. It's up to you. You can use if you have 17 is fine as well. I will point it, it's already pointed towards the PfSense ISO file that you have already downloaded. I'm gonna place the links in the description of this this video, download links for the ISO file. And then I'm gonna pick a name. I'm gonna name that PfSense 1. And of course you can pick where you want to place the virtual machine. How many processors? PfSense is usually, it depends of course on the amount of traffic that you're expecting, but for trial purposes I'm going to have 2 processors and 2 cores per processor. It totally depends on your host machine. In terms of RAM, I'm going to allocate 4 gigabytes of RAM. So when we are selecting the network type, remember that we're going to have 2 network interfaces, so it doesn't matter what we select now. We're going to alter that again. I'm going to leave that to the default, leaving that to the default as well. Create a new disk, and then I think 20 gigabytes is enough, so I'll keep it at 20 gigabytes. I usually like to keep them as a single file. File name, I'll leave that to the default as well. Now before I click finish, I'm going to customize hardware to make sure that I have the correct network setup. So now I have one network adapter, as you can see here. I'm going to add another network adapter. Add network adapter. Now I have a second one. depending on the setup that you want to do, I'm going to have the first network adapter connected to the custom network that I created, the internal network, VMnet 11. And the second one, I'm going to keep it at NAT because NAT will connect me to the internet for now. Make sure that both of them connect on power on, VMnet 11 and NAT, and close. And of course you can do some additional stuff like making sure that you have USB 3 here if you intend to connect some USB devices. And that's it. There is no, yeah, that's all for now. So we'll walk through the installation steps now for PfSense. It's going to take a moment usually. So this is the copyright and distribution notice that we usually do not read and always hit accept. And let's hit accept. So it's asking what do we want to do. We want to install. I'm going to keep the default key map, keep the partitioning auto as well. It handles the partitioning very well. I don't need to do that manually. And yes. No redundancy. I'm not using any RAID technology now. Now you can just press space to mark which drive you want to use and then enter. Are you sure? I'm gonna use the left arrow and yes, I am sure. It's gonna take a moment. The installation is now finished. Before exiting the installer, would you like to open a shell in a new window? No, I don't want that. You want to reboot? Yes, I'd like to reboot. So after the reboot, we'll have to make primary settings first so that we would enable the web interface. You know, PfSense, obviously, we will configure it using the web interface. But in order to enable the web interface, we need to make sure that we tell the firewall which interface is the internal network, which interface is the external network, and do some IP settings as well to make sure that everything is in line before we access it through the setup, through the internal web interface. So you can see that it's trying to figure out which interface is the LAN interface and which interface is the WAN interface. It's not going to figure it out. So we'll have to configure that manually, and that will be done through a command line menu, as you'll see. That will take a moment. So let's sit tight and see how this goes. Okay, so now we have the settings menu, as you can see. So our first step will start from number 1, which is assigning interfaces, telling the firewall which interface is the LAN interface and which interface is the WAN interface. So we'll hit 1, So it's asking, should VLANs be set up now? For our simple installation, we're not setting up any VLANs. So I'm going to say no. Then enter the WAN interface. So what is the WAN interface? Remember that our 0 interface, the first one was connected to VMnet 11, and the second interface, which is EM1 here, is connected to the internet. So it's asking enter the WAN interface, and the WAN interface is EM1 in this scenario. Depending on your setup, if you have selected the first interface to be NAT and the second interface to be the local network, then what you need to put down here is EM0. But for our case, it's EM1. Enter the LAN interface name. LAN interface is EM0 in this case. Are you sure? Yes, I am sure. So it's reloading the configuration, because when it was trying to figure it out on its own, automatically it didn't figure it out correctly. And because of that, we have to do that manually. Okay, now we're done with setting up the interfaces. The second step is number 2, which is set IP addresses. Interface IP addresses. So you can see EM1 is set up to obtain IP address through DHCP, which works fine because in our NAT settings on VMware, VMware will assign IP address automatically, so we can leave that as it is, and then go to number 2, the LAN. Enter the IP address of the LAN. So for our scenario, we will use I forgot the numlock is off. 192.168, let's say .1.1. Then the subnet mask needs to be in CIDR notation, which means we'll use 24, which represents 255.255.255.0. For WAN, enter the new what is that? The upstream gateway. For LAN, press enter. We don't have an upstream gateway. IP version 6, if you want to use IP version 6, now is the time to set up the IP version 6 address. I'll not assign an IP version 6. Do you want to enable DHCP server? If you remember, we said we disabled the DHCP server in VMware so that we can use the firewall as a DHCP server. So it's time to say yes for this. Enter the start address. We started at 192.168.1.1, so we'll have the DHCP range start at .10 and maybe end at .100, 192.168.1.100. Do you want to revert to HTTP as the web configurator protocol? So what is this question? It's asking us the default setting to access the web interface is through HTTPS. But because this is a fresh installation, we haven't installed a signed certificate, we're going to have a warning with HTTPS. So you need to pay attention to that. If you want to disable HTTPS, then you have to say yes to this if you want to revert to HTTP. My recommendation is no. Let's use HTTPS. We know that the certificate is not signed. So when we get that warning, we can just accept the warning and move on. So do you want to revert to HTTP? I'm going to say no. Let's wait for it to start. So now you can see it says that you can access from the internal network using 192.168.1.1. So now is the time to leave everything here and move on to the internal client so that we can access the web interface. So what I'm doing here is, this is the client that I'm going to use. I just make sure that I set it to VMnet 11 before I started. Okay, and then I'll move on to start the client. Okay, so starting the client on VMnet 11. If everything goes well, what should happen now is that Ubuntu machine that I'm using as a client should obtain an IP address automatically from the firewall and should also have access to the internet by default. If it doesn't, most probably the case is an issue with DHCP. So if yours doesn't get an IP address directly, then I would recommend that you do the following. Shut down the client machine, shut down the firewall, and then restart the firewall. Give it a few minutes to fully start up so that you make sure that the DHCP service is running, and then you start the client machine. So we can just double check by ifconfig, and yes, we have an IP address, as you can see. Let's see if we have internet access. We can go somewhere like VirusTotal and unable to connect. Which means that we don't have internet access. Network is unreachable, so I want to make sure that everything's connected properly. We are connected here. You can try turning off and turning on. Sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't help, I'm gonna have to restart. Just make sure that I have proper DHCP settings. Yes, that's correct. I have proper IP address, and the network is unreachable. So let's shut down as we said earlier. I'll power this off, and then we will power this off as well. Right click here, power. We'll restart the guest. We'll give it a moment to fully start up, and until we get the same menu that we had before we start the client machine, just to make sure that the DHCP service is actually up and running. Okay, now it's supposed to be running. This is working properly, this is working properly, and let's hit that and see. Okay, log in. You have the right IP address, which is good. Let's try to ping one more time, and ping is working, which means that we have internet access. Everything is in line now. So we'll start with simple configuration. 192.168, we'll start with 1.1, which is our firewall. Now you can see we have a warning. It says it's not secure. If you take a look at what is the reason, certificate is not trusted because it is self-signed, which makes sense because we've just installed the firewall, so We haven't installed any certificate to it, so it has its own self-signed certificate. We'll accept and go on. Now the default setting is admin PfSense. Admin, and the password is PfSense. Of course, we will be asked to change it. Welcome to PfSense. Let's walk through this. The setup wizard. Some advertisements. What do we want to call it? And what is our domain? We can call it test.com and the hostname PfSense. If we want to override the DNS that's provided by the service provider, we can add DNS addresses here. It's important to set up the timing properly because of the log files. You need to make sure that all of your logs are having the correct timing. Otherwise it could cause problems if you ingest that log into another system. So I'm going to leave the configuration as it is. We've already set it up. I'm not going to change anything. The IP address, I'm going to leave it as it is. Now we need to change the admin password. Always use long passwords. Don't save, thank you. Reload. We can of course check for updates. My version is a bit old, so it's advised that you check for updates and you install the update if there is one. Copyright that we do not read, and we always hit accept. Thank you, yes, okay. Now most of what we will do later on, you can see there is an update. Most of what we do is going to be in the firewall rules section most of the time. Of course there is NAT and few other things that we can do, but we're keeping it simple now. So we'll go over to rules. Now you can see we have rules applied to LAN, rules applied to the WAN interface. If you want to add a rule, now we keep in mind that firewalls, just like any other access control list, rules are executed in sequential mode, which means that if the packet meets the first condition, then the action will be performed and will jump out of the block. If it doesn't meet the first condition, it will move to the second condition. If it's met, then we'll do the action and jump out of the block. And that's why you can see we have two options, whether you want to add the new rule up or add it down, because the order of rules is very important in firewalls. So let's take a look on the LAN. Let's do just a very simple example before we wrap up today. We will add a rule up. Now, one of the rules that you will always find and you should not be changing is anti-lockout rule, which prevents you from locking yourself out from this interface. Whatever you add here is going to be added after the first one, because they want to make sure that you do not prevent yourself from accessing this interface by making any mistakes. So we are going to block something. Of course there is block and reject. Block means that we are ignoring the traffic and not responding to it. Reject means that we send an ICMP message that says the traffic has been rejected. So it's a common practice that we use block instead of reject. Sometimes we use reject for testing purposes. Moving on the LAN interface, IP version 4. I'm not going to use TCMP. I'm going to block ICMP traffic to one website. Let's pick one. Let's see. Dig youtube.com. Okay. This is the IP address of YouTube. I'm going to copy it and then I'm going to block ping to YouTube. Okay. So of course you can see that there is very fine selection. You can choose even echo reply and echo request, for example, specifically to prevent it, or you can block all of ICMP traffic. Source from our internal LAN network, as you see here, LAN net. and the destination is a single host. This host is this IP address of youtube.com that we just saw. So always put description blog ping to youtube.com, and we want to log the packets as well. Save, and you can see the one that we added was not added at the top, it was added as the second one. Apply changes. Now changes have been applied. Now if I try to ping youtube.com, you can see there is no response. 8 packets transmitted, 0 received. If I go over here and I disable this, just shortly disable and apply changes, and then I try ping again, and now we have response. I'm going to re-enable it and apply changes. Of course, you can see the rules can be very detailed. You can choose which interface, you can choose which specific protocol. If you have a set of source IP addresses, for example, or specific, one address only, or the whole network, or a full network, you can choose what specific port numbers, for example, if it's used TCP or UDP. Always place a description. Now, if you remember, we said that we are logging everything, so we can actually look at the logs. Let me search. I need to remind myself where the logs are. Okay, that's going to take some time. So where are the logs? And by the way, you can see the certificate manager. You can install a signed certificate so you don't receive these warnings. Logs, yeah. Firewall logs. You can see this traffic that was blocked. Ping, blog, ping to YouTube. These are the packets, the 8 packets that we have sent. You can see they were blocked from this IP address to this IP address according to this rule that we have created. So anyway, yeah, after you install, just play around, try to block different things, try to reject different things and see the difference in the response. I hope that you find this useful. If you have any questions, just write them down in the comment section, and I'll see you soon.